Here we're going to perform operations with functions. We're going to add two functions together. We're going to subtract one function from the other. We're going to multiply the two functions, and we're going to divide the two functions. And we're given two functions here to work with. F of x is equal to x minus 4, and g of x is equal to the square root of 9 minus x squared. And then we're to state the domain of each new function after we add them together, subtract f of x or subtract g of x from f of x, multiply f of x and g of x, and then divide. And before we get started on that, let's look at what we have, because in my original functions, there's two big things. Two, can't get the two in the camera. There's two. Two big things that could cause us to have a restriction to the domain. One, we can't take the square root of a negative number in the real number world, and we cannot divide by 0. And anything that would cause us to do that, whether in each individual function itself or after we perform the operations, would cause us to have a restriction in the domain. But let's get started. We're just going to add these two together. So f of x is x minus 4, and we're going to add to that the square root of 9 minus x squared. Well, those are three different terms. X is a term, negative 4 is a term, square root of 9 minus x squared is a term. And Shazam, that actually is the answer when I add those two together. That wasn't too bad. However, let's think about what's the domain. Now the domain has got to be such that I'm not going to take the square root of a negative number. And I've got 9 minus x squared. Well, in order to solve for that domain, I want to think about what would cause me to take the square root of a negative number. Zero is okay. So I could set what's inside that radical there as 9 minus x squared is equal to 0. I got to be 0. Anything 0 or greater is going to be okay. So then I've got 9 equals, we'll solve for x squared. And then we take the square root of both sides. And the square root of 9 is plus or minus 3. Now let's plug that back in and think about that. So if I put in negative 3 for x squared, the negative 3 squared is 9, and then I'd have 9 minus 9 is 0, and that's okay. But if I put a positive 3 in for x squared into this right here, well, positive 3 squared is 9. 9 minus 9 is 0. I got to be greater than 0. Because if I put, let's say if I put 4 in there, 4 squared is 16. 9 minus 16 is going to be negative 7. Can't use that. So my domain then is restricted to an interval. We're using interval notation where x can equal negative 3, and it can equal 3, and it can equal anything in between negative 3 and 3. Would still be okay. Put 2 squared in there. 2 squared is 4, 9 minus 4 is 5. That's okay. Square root of 5 is okay. Okay, well, there we go. Now let's think about subtracting these. So this is f plus g of x. And what about f minus g of x? All right, f minus g of x, well, we're just going to subtract these, so I would have x minus 4 minus g of x, which is the square root of 9 minus x squared. And I could actually just drop that parentheses if I wanted to where it would just read as x minus 4 minus the square root of 9 minus x squared. Now, what about my domain? Question, is my domain restriction going to be any different than when I added that? I still can't take the square root of a negative number. I've got to be 0 or higher, right? And I can't get too high with the value of x, because if I do, I'm going to end up with a negative number, no matter whether it's, and I can't get too low with x, because if it's, since a negative squared is going to be a positive, I got the same issue. So my domain is the same as what it was in interval notation. It's got to be between -3 and 3, and it can include -3 and 3. All right, now let's multiply these two together. So over here we're going to have f times g of x. And let's see, f of x was what? X minus 4. So I got x minus 4 times, and g of x is the square root of 9 minus x squared. All right, well, let's see. I'm just going to do some distribution. I'm going to x times the square root of 9 minus x. The square root of 9 minus x squared is x times square root of 9 minus x squared. That's a sloppy square root symbol, isn't it? And then -4 times square root of 9 minus x squared is just -4 times the square root of 9 minus x squared. Okay, well, that's multiplying the two of them together. Now, again, I want to think about my domain restriction. And really, it's not changed from anything that we did when we added or subtracted them. And so my domain, using interval notation, is -3, 3. Anything between, but including -3, up to and including 3, positive 3, is the domain of f times g of x. And then lastly, we're going to divide. So we got f of x divided by g of x. Well, we got f of x is x minus 4, and g of x is the square root of 9 minus x squared. And I have a question for you. Is there anything that we didn't see any change in the domain in the first 3 operations? But what about this time? Remember, I got 2 big rules. One, I cannot take the square root of a negative number. We've established that that needs to be between -3 and 3. But what if it included -3 or positive 3? Well, -3 squared is 9, and 9 minus 9 is 0. Uh-oh, I can't include -3 in my domain. Because then the square root of 0 is 0, and I'd be trying to divide by 0. How about if I put in a positive 3 into x squared? Well, that would also be 9. 3 squared is 9. 9 minus 9 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0, and so it cannot be included. So this time my domain's got a slight change in that my interval is still -3 and 3, but I cannot include -3 and 3. So notice the difference. Over here I used a bracket. That means that those -3 and 3 are included in the solution set. Here we used a parentheses, which means that we can go right up to that amount, but we cannot include that. So -3 and 3. Shall we do another operation of functions between 2 functions? Yes, we shall. All right, so this time we got x squared minus 6x minus 8 times the square root of x. Well, we start off by adding them together. So we got x squared, this is f of x, minus 6x minus 8 plus the square root of x. Well, those are four different terms. X squared is a term, negative 6x is a term, negative 8 is a term, square root of x is a term. I don't have any like terms to combine, so now I need to focus on my domain. Well, what can my domain not equal? It can't be a negative number, can it? Well, it could be 0. So then I could say that my domain must be equal to 0, and I can include 0. So I need to put a bracket 0 out to infinity. And we always designate infinity or negative infinity with a parenthesis. So this is f plus g of x. All right, how about f minus g of x? Okay, well, we start off with x squared minus 6x minus 8, and then we're going to subtract from it the square root of x. Still got four terms, can't combine anything, so that's okay. What about my domain? Did my domain change from the previous one? I can't take square root of a negative number, so it can include 0 and then out to infinity. Just cannot be a negative number. Okay, well now let's move over and multiply these. All right, so now we got f times g of x. And let's see, f of x was x squared minus 6x minus 8. And now we're going to multiply that by g of x, which was the square root of x. Well, we're really just going to distribute this square root of x to these other three terms. So now we've got x squared times the square root of x. And then we got negative 6x times the square root of x. I really don't have to put that parentheses in there. Well, yeah, it makes it look better. And then I've got negative 8 times the square root of x. Okay, well that did that. What about my domain? Does it change from the previous two when I added and subtracted? No, the domain restriction I would have would be trying to take the square root of a negative number. So it can include 0 on out to infinity, but it just cannot be less than 0. Last up, f of x divided by g of x. All right, well, f of x is x squared, minus 6x minus 8. Now we're dividing it by the square root of x. And now I have thrown in a different, something else that would create a domain restriction. We already know that one of those, in taking the square root of something, I can't have a negative number. So it's got to be a positive number. But what about 0? Can 0 now be included in my domain like it was in the other three? Well, the answer to that is no, because the square root of 0 would be 0, and now I'd be trying to divide by 0, and that's undefined. So my domain now is equal to, it's between but not including 0 out to infinity. And again, the distinction is the bracket versus the parentheses as we're writing those in interval notation. Practice, 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 practice. Patience, 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 patience. Perseverance, perseverance, perseverance.